I told you to leave this territory and never return. King David's voice was a low, dangerous rasp that echoed through the marble throne room. You told a scared, heartbroken girl to leave, David? Lisa replied. Her voice, once soft like summer rain, now carried the chilling weight of a winter storm. She didn't bow. She didn't flinch. The heavy velvet of her midnight gown swept across the stone as she stepped closer, flanked by guards bearing the crest of the Eastern Empire. That girl vanished the night you severed our bond. I am the sovereign of the East now. She tilted her chin, her eyes flashing with cold, unyielding fire. And I haven't come to beg. I have come to collect. The great hall of Ethelgard was perpetually cold. A drafty cavern of ancient stone that no amount of roaring hearth fire could truly warm. At the center of the room, a massive oak table groaned under the weight of parchment maps, ledger books, and the exhaustion of the men gathered around it. King David stood at the head, his hands braced against the scarred wood. The silver crown rested heavy on his brow, though it was the invisible weight upon his shoulders that bowed his posture. The southern grain reserves are entirely depleted, Your Majesty, Lord Aris murmured, tracing a wrinkled finger over a section of the map marked with fading ink. The early frost decimated the autumn harvest. If we do not secure an import treaty before the first snow falls, we will be facing famine by midwinter. David stared at the map, though he did not truly see the lines delineating his struggling kingdom. Instead, he saw the relentless, freezing rain of a night 5 years ago. He felt the phantom sting on his left wrist, right over his pulse point. The bond mark. Once, it had been a luminescent, intertwining crest of a wolf and a crescent moon, glowing with the heat of a fated mate connection. Now, it was a jagged, faded scar, pale and dead. He had severed it himself. It was a brutal, ancient ritual, one that demanded the Alpha King reject his fated match in front of the ancestral stones if she was deemed unfit to rule. Lisa had been a ward of the court. Quiet, sweet, lacking the political backing or ruthless cunning required to survive Ethelgard's viper nest of a nobility. David had convinced himself he was doing it to protect his kingdom. He had convinced himself he was doing it to protect her from a court that would have eaten her alive. I, David of Ethelgard, reject this bond. You are not my queen. Leave these lands before dawn, or be hunted as a trespasser. He closed his eyes, the memory of her shattered gasp echoing in his mind, louder than the bickering of his counselors. She had run into the storm, vanishing without a trace. No tracker had been able to catch her scent. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her to hide her from his cruelty. Your Majesty? Lord Thorne's sharp voice dragged David back to the present. Thorne was an older, calculating man who had been the loudest advocate for Lisa's rejection. You are not listening. The Eastern Empire has absorbed the free cities of Oakhaven. Their new ruler, the one they call the Iron Queen, has amassed a monopoly on the continent's grain. We have no choice but to negotiate. I am aware of the geopolitical reality, Thorne, David replied, his voice a low rumble that instantly silenced the room. Even without his fated mate, his alpha aura was suffocating, a heavy, commanding pressure that demanded absolute submission. We sent an envoy 3 weeks ago to offer a trade alliance. We have heard nothing. Actually, sire, a timid voice spoke up from the doorway. A breathless scout stood there, his cloak soaked with mud and rain. The man dropped to one knee, trembling under the sudden weight of the Alpha King's gaze. Speak, David commanded, straightening his spine. The envoy has returned, Your Majesty. But he did not return alone. The scout swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and sheer terror. The Eastern Empire's host is at our gates. 1,000 elite cavalry, draped in midnight and silver. And the Iron Queen is with them. She demands an immediate audience. A murmur of shock rippled through the council. Sovereigns did not act as their own diplomats. It was a breach of protocol, a display of overwhelming confidence, and a thinly veiled threat. She brings an army to our doorstep to negotiate trade? Lord Aris sputtered, his face turning pale. This is a siege. It is a display of power, David corrected, his jaw tightening. A strange, inexplicable hum began to vibrate beneath his skin. It was a sensation he had not felt in half a decade. The faded scar on his wrist pulsed, a dull, phantom ache that made his blood run hot. She knows we are weak. She wants us to see exactly what we are dealing with before we sit at the table. David turned away from the map, adjusting the heavy clasp of his royal mantle. He forced his breathing to slow, burying the sudden, frantic beating of his heart beneath a mask of absolute authority. "Let her in," David ordered, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Prepare the throne room. If the Iron Queen wishes to look the Alpha King of Ethelgard in the eye, I will not deny her the privilege." As the Lord scrambled to follow his orders, David touched his wrist beneath the heavy fabric of his sleeve. The scar was burning. Logic told him it was impossible. A severed bond could not reignite. But as he walked toward the throne room, every instinct in his body was screaming that the ghost he had spent 5 years trying to forget was standing at his door. The heavy oak doors of the throne room stood closed, guarded by 4 of Ethelgard's finest sentinels. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished brass, burning pine, and the nervous sweat of the nobility. Every lord and lady of consequence had gathered, forming an aisle of velvet and silk that led directly to the dais where David sat. He remained perfectly still, his posture rigid, his features carved from granite. He was an Alpha King. He did not show fear. He did not show anticipation. Yet, the phantom burning on his wrist was becoming unbearable. It was a searing heat, biting into his flesh, warning him of an approaching shift in his reality. Thud. A heavy strike against the outside of the oak doors silenced the murmuring crowd. Thud. The guards gripped the heavy iron handles, pulling the massive doors inward. The hinges groaned, a long, drawn-out sound that felt like a held breath. First came the guards of the Eastern Empire. They moved with terrifying synchronicity, their armor a dark, burnished steel that drank the torchlight rather than reflecting it. They fanned out silently, creating a perimeter that subtly, but firmly, pushed Ethelgard's own guards back. It was an immediate, calculated dominance of the space. Then, the murmurs completely died. The silence that fell over the hall was absolute, heavy enough to crush a man. David's breath hitched in his throat. His hands gripped the stone armrests of his throne so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Stepping across the threshold was a woman who commanded the room the moment her foot touched the marble. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, structured and armored at the shoulders with silver filigree that resembled overlapping blades. A delicate but sharp silver crown sat atop her head, weaving through hair that was no longer left in loose, timid curls, but braided and pinned with military precision. It was Lisa, but it was not the Lisa he remembered. The girl he had rejected had smelled of lilacs and nervous rain, her eyes constantly darting downward, seeking approval, terrified of taking up space. The woman walking toward him now smelled of frost, iron, and a predatory calm. Her eyes, a striking, piercing hazel, were locked onto David with the intensity of a hawk zeroing in on a field mouse. She did not look at the lords who had once sneered at her. She did not acknowledge the whispers that were beginning to break the silence like cracking ice. Is that? It cannot be. The king cast her out. She looks like a goddess of war. David forced himself to stand. It was a sign of respect he rarely afforded visiting diplomats, but his body moved before his logical mind could stop it. The alpha inside him, the wolf that had howled in agony for months after the rejection, was clawing at his chest, demanding he close the distance. He locked the beast down, forcing his expression to remain impassive. Lisa stopped exactly 10 paces from the dais. She did not bow. Her Eastern guards stood at attention, hands resting casually, yet dangerously, on the pommels of their swords. "King David?" Lisa spoke. Her voice cut through the cavernous room, clear, melodic, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the sound of a perfectly tuned instrument playing a funeral dirge. "Queen Ilara," David replied, using the name the scouts had reported. He kept his voice steady, testing the waters. "Or do you prefer I use the name you were given in my lands?" A small, chilling smile graced Lisa's lips. It did not reach her eyes. "Names hold power, Your Majesty. Ilara is the title my people gave me when I dragged them out of the Dark Ages. But Lisa is the name of the girl you murdered in the mud 5 years ago. You may use whichever makes you sleep better at night." A collective gasp echoed through the court. Lord Thorne stepped forward, his face flushed with indignity. "You dare speak to the Alpha King with such insolence? You are an Ethelgard woman, not your barbarous eastern wastes. You will bow." Lisa didn't even turn her head to look at Thorne. She simply flicked 2 fingers. The sound of 20 steel blades sliding halfway out of their scabbards rang through the hall. A sharp, metallic hiss that froze the blood in Thorne's veins. Ethelgard's guards instantly drew their weapons in response, the tension in the room snapping tight like a garrote wire. "Stand down," David roared, his alpha command washing over the room. His own guards immediately sheathed their swords, trembling under his pressure. Lisa raised her hand, and her guards slid their weapons away in perfect, silent unison. She finally turned her gaze to Lord Thorne, her eyes narrowed. "I bow to no one, Lord Thorne, especially not to the men who convinced their king that starvation was preferable to a commoner queen. Tell me, how does your pride taste now that your silos are filled with dust?" Thorne opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stepped back, visibly shaken by the sheer, suffocating weight of her presence. She had an aura of her own now. It wasn't the brute, heavy force of an alpha. It was the cold, slicing pressure of an absolute sovereign. David descended the steps of the dais, his heavy boots clicking against the marble. He stopped 3 paces from her. Up close, the changes in her were even more devastating. There was a tiny, faded scar near her temple that hadn't been there before. Her skin was flawless, but it held the pale translucence of someone who had survived harsh, sunless winters. "You did not come all this way simply to insult my counselors, Lisa," David said softly, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear the slight waver in it. "No," Lisa replied, her voice equally quiet, but hard as diamond. "I came to offer you a choice, David. You need 50,000 bushels of grain to survive the winter. You need access to the eastern trade routes to rebuild your dying economy. I have all of it." "And what is the price?" David asked, his chest tightening. Lisa leaned in slightly, the scent of frost and iron washing over him, making his severed bond scream in protest. "The price," she whispered, "is that you sign a treaty declaring Ethelgard a vassal state to the Eastern Empire. You keep your crown, but you kneel to me." The silence that followed Lisa's demand was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating pressure that descended upon the throne room like a collapsed roof. To the lords of Ethelgard, a kingdom forged in the blood of conquerors and sustained by an unyielding, aggressive pride, the concept of vassalage was indistinguishable from death. For the Alpha King to kneel was to break the very spine of their sovereignty. Lord Thorn was the first to shatter the quiet. His face, previously drained of color, now flushed a violently mottled crimson. "Treason!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and aristocratic outrage. He drew his ceremonial dagger, a foolish, trembling gesture, against the immovable wall of the Eastern elite guard. "You come into our halls, eat our salt by simply breathing our air, and demand the subjugation of a sovereign state? You are a madwoman. We will see you burn before an Alpha King kneels to a cast-out stray." The temperature in the room plummeted. The Eastern guards did not draw their blades this time. They simply shifted their weight, their eyes locking onto Thorn with the dispassionate focus of executioners awaiting a nod. Lisa did not look at Thorn. She did not even blink. Her hazel eyes remained entirely fixed on David, holding his gaze with a terrifying, serene stillness. She was waiting to see what the king would do, testing the current strength of the man who had once broken her to protect these very fools. David felt the ancestral beast within him thrash against his ribs. The alpha instinct to roar, to demand submission, to tear the throat out of the man who dared raise a weapon in his presence, warred viciously with the cold, calculating mind of a ruler staring down the barrel of an unwinnable war. If blood was drawn here, today, Ethelgard would be ash by the week's end. "Drop the dagger, Thorn," David commanded. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried the absolute crushing weight of his lineage. "Your Majesty, she demands our destruction," Thorn protested, his hands shaking violently. "I said drop it," David repeated, taking a single, deliberate step toward his counselor. The sheer force of his aura, the heavy, dominant pressure that had kept the warring factions of his court in line for years, flared outward. Thorn choked on his next words, the physical manifestation of David's power forcing him to his knees. The ceremonial dagger clattered uselessly against the polished marble floor. David turned his back on the gasping lord, his attention returning to the woman who had once been his fated mate. The anger in his chest was a living, breathing entity, but beneath it lay an agonizing layer of profound sorrow. He saw the iron in her posture, the defensive plating of her armor, and he knew, with sickening clarity, that he was the one who had forged this weapon. He had taught her that vulnerability was a death sentence. "You have made your position abundantly clear, Queen Alara," David said, his tone perfectly measured, though his jaw ached from the tension of keeping his expression neutral. "However, negotiations that dictate the fate of millions are not conducted as a spectacle for the gallery. If you wish to discuss terms that will reshape the continent, we will do so in my private solar, alone." A ripple of nervous energy swept through the Eastern Guard, their captain taking a half-step forward to object to his monarch being isolated with an alpha. Lisa raised a single, gloved hand, instantly freezing her captain in place. "Very well," Lisa agreed, her voice a smooth, icy stream. "I have no need for an audience to state facts. Lead the way, Your Majesty." David gave a sharp nod, turning toward the heavy velvet curtains that concealed the corridor leading to the royal private chambers. He did not look back to see if she was following. The rhythmic, confident click of her armored heels against the stone told him she was right behind him. The walk through the windy, dimly lit corridors of Ethelgard was agonizing. The castle, once a symbol of unshakable strength, now felt drafty and decaying. The tapestries were faded by time and neglect. The torches burned with sputtering, low-grade oil. Everything spoke of a kingdom slowly bleeding out. David was hyper-aware of Lisa's presence behind him. He remembered a time, half a decade ago, when she would walk these same halls with her head bowed, shrinking against the stone to avoid the mocking glares of the courtiers, her scent a sweet, anxious flutter of lilacs. Now, she took up the entire corridor without speaking a word. Her scent was an imposing, crisp frost, carrying the metallic tang of power and absolute control. The phantom scar on his wrist pulsed in time with her footsteps, a cruel, rhythmic reminder of the invisible tether that he had severed, yet somehow still remained. David pushed open the heavy oak door of his private solar. It was a utilitarian room, stripped of luxurious trappings, dominated by a large hearth and walls lined with dusty, leather-bound tomes. He stepped inside, gesturing for her to follow. Lisa crossed the threshold, her gaze sweeping over the room with analytical precision. She noted the dying embers in the hearth, the stack of unpaid mercenary ledgers on his desk, the frayed edges of the map pinned to the wall. She was cataloging his failures, mapping the exact dimensions of his desperation. David closed the door, the heavy latch falling into place with a definitive click. They were alone. For the first time in 5 years, there were no counselors, no guards, no ancestral stones to witness them. "You can drop the theatrics, Lisa," David said softly, the exhaustion finally bleeding into his voice as he leaned back against the heavy wooden door. "There is no one left to perform for." Lisa turned to face him, the flickering light of the low fire catching the silver edges of her crown. Her expression remained an impenetrable mask of porcelain and steel. "I am not performing, David," she replied, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "I am simply giving you the bill for the choices you made." The silence in the solar stretched thin, vibrating like a drawn bowstring. David stared at the woman standing before his desk, desperately searching her features for a glimpse of the gentle ward he had once known. He found nothing. The soft, rounded edges of her youth had been chiseled away, replaced by the sharp, imposing angles of a sovereign who had survived a crucible. "You want me to kneel," David said, crossing his arms over his broad chest to keep himself from reaching out, from closing the agonizing distance between them. "You want to reduce Ethelgard to a vassal state. It is an impossible demand, and you are far too intelligent not to know that. My lords would rebel, the populace would riot. You would inherit a kingdom of ashes." Lisa moved gracefully toward the large, scarred wooden desk, her gloved fingers lightly tracing the worn edges of a map depicting the northern border. "Your kingdom is already turning to ash, David. You are simply refusing to smell the smoke." She looked up, her hazel eyes cutting through the dim light to pin him against the heavy oak door. "Your southern grain reserves are empty. Your western trade routes are blocked by the Oakhaven consolidation. Your military is underfed and demoralized. You have exactly 4 months before your people begin starving in the streets. And when they do, your precious, arrogant lords will turn on you to save their own estates." David's jaw tightened. He could not refute her logic. It was exactly the grim reality he had spent the last 3 nights agonizing over in this very room. "So, this is revenge," he said, his voice laced with a bitter sorrow. "You starved my trade routes, bought out the free cities, and cornered the grain market just to force me to my knees, to punish me for rejecting the bond." A flicker of something dark and dangerous passed behind Lisa's eyes, a momentary crack in her icy facade. "Do not flatter yourself, Your Majesty," she snapped, her tone dripping with sudden, venomous disdain. I did not build an empire simply to spite a man who was too weak to stand by his mate. The words struck him like physical blows, driving the air from his lungs. The alpha inside him recoiled, deeply wounded by the undeniable truth of her accusation. I did what was necessary, David argued, pushing away from the door and stepping further into the room, his voice rising in quiet desperation. You do not understand the politics of this court. Thorn and his faction would have assassinated you within a month of our coronation. You were soft, Lisa. You were kind. In Ethelgard, kindness is a target painted on your back. I severed the bond to save your life. Lisa did not flinch as he approached. Instead, she straightened, her aura intensifying until it felt like the gravity in the room had shifted. You stole my choice, she stated, her voice trembling with an ancient, deeply buried rage that she masterfully kept under control. You looked at me, decided I was too weak to survive, and threw me to the wolves without giving me the chance to prove you wrong. You humiliated me before the ancestral stones, branded me a failure, and cast me into a freezing storm. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The scent of frost grew sharp enough to make David's eyes water. And the great irony, David? The wolves you threw me to did not eat me. I became their alpha. David stared at her, the phantom scar on his wrist burning with such intense, fiery agony that he had to physically clench his fist to hide the tremor in his hand. She was right. He had underestimated her entirely. The girl he thought needed saving had possessed a core of iron he had been too blind to see. Then why are you here? David asked, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. If this is not revenge, if you truly do not care about the man who broke you, why offer the grain at all? Why not let Ethelgard starve and simply march your army over our bones in the spring? Lisa held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The anger slowly faded from her eyes, replaced by a weary, grim pragmatism. She turned back to the map on the desk, picking up a heavy iron paperweight and moving it to the far northern edge of the parchment, beyond the known borders of their territories. Because of the vanguard horde, she said quietly. David frowned, moving to stand beside her at the desk. The proximity was intoxicating, a confusing blend of past longing and present danger. The vanguard are a myth, he said, looking down at the map. Bedtime stories told to frighten children into obedience. A disorganized rabble of wildlings in the frozen wastes. They were a disorganized rabble? Lisa corrected, her finger tracing a sweeping path downward from the north. Until 3 years ago, when a warlord united the disparate tribes. They are no longer a myth, David. They are an army of 80,000, immune to the cold, bred for slaughter, and they have exhausted the resources of the deep north. They are moving south. She tapped the paperweight down on the northern border of Ethelgard. Your kingdom is the only geographical barrier between the horde and the fertile lands of the Eastern Empire. If Ethelgard falls, my empire is exposed. I cannot allow that. The strategic reality crashed over David like a tidal wave. You need us as a buffer. I need a fortified, well-fed, heavily armed wall. Lisa corrected coldly. I am willing to provide the grain to feed your soldiers, the steel to arm them, and the coin to fortify your northern keeps. But I will not hand over the lifeblood of my empire to a king who has proven he bows to the whims of a cowardly, short-sighted council. She turned her head, her face mere inches from his. He could see the faint, pulsing rhythm of her pulse beneath the flawless skin of her throat. I demand vassalage because I need absolute structural control over this defense. Lisa finalized, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. I will not trust an equal alliance with a man who breaks his most sacred bonds when the pressure mounts. You will kneel, David, and you will surrender command of your armies to me. Or I will leave you to starve and fight the horde on my own terms when they step over your frozen corpse. The words hung in the stale air of the private solar, a heavy, suffocating decree that seemed to drain the very oxygen from the room. David stared at the woman before him, trying to reconcile the terrifying sovereign demanding his absolute submission with the gentle girl who used to read poetry by this very hearth. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across Lisa's face, highlighting the sharp, unyielding line of her jaw and the cold, pragmatic calculation in her hazel eyes. She was not bluffing. She was a master architect who had studied the crumbling foundations of his kingdom and arrived with the exact blueprints required to tear it down or rebuild it under her banner. Vassalage, David repeated, the word tasting like crushed glass on his tongue. He stepped back from the desk, needing to put physical distance between himself and the overwhelming scent of frost and iron that radiated from her. You asked me to surrender the sovereignty of a bloodline that has ruled these lands for 6 centuries. You asked me to hand over the ancestral armies of Ethelgard. The council will tear the kingdom apart from the inside before they allow foreign banners to fly over our battlements. They will call it a conquering. It is a conquering, David, Lisa replied, her voice maintaining that terrifying, level calm. She did not move from the desk. She simply watched him pace with the detached interest of a predator observing a caged animal. But it is a conquering by logistics, not by the sword. I am conquering your starvation. I am conquering your vulnerability. Your lords can cling to their pride while they freeze to death, or they can surrender their pride and live. That is the fundamental logic of survival. Something I learned very intimately the night I was cast out. David winced, the reminder striking exactly where she intended. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths. The agonizing proximity was wreaking havoc on his senses. Despite the mental fortitude he had built over 5 years, the alpha within him recognized her. The beast did not care about treaties or the vanguard horde. It only knew that its mate was standing in the room, armored in ice and radiating a power that commanded profound respect. There must be another way, David said, his voice dropping to a rough, pleading timbre that he had not used since his father lay on his deathbed. An alliance, a marriage treaty, a blending of our houses as equals. If we stand together against this horde, equals, Lisa interrupted, the word slicing through the air like a freshly honed blade. For the first time since she entered the castle, a flash of genuine, visceral emotion cracked her porcelain mask. We are not equals, David. You are a king presiding over a graveyard. I am a queen who built an empire from the dirt you threw me into. You do not get to claim equality only when the wolves are at your door. She took a sudden, fluid step toward him. The distance between them vanished, reduced to mere inches. David froze, his breath hitching as the ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He looked down into her eyes, seeing the swirling, storm-tossed depths of unresolved pain and absolute conviction. Without thinking, driven by a primal instinct he could no longer suppress, David reached out. His large, calloused hand moved slowly, trembling slightly, before his fingers lightly brushed the cold silver filigree of the armor on her shoulder. The moment they made contact, a violent electric shock rippled through the air between them. The jagged, faded scar on David's left wrist flared with a blinding, searing heat. glowing a faint, ghostly silver through the fabric of his sleeve. Lisa gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound that betrayed her iron control. Her own hand instinctively darted to her chest, right over her heart, where a matching severed mark lay hidden beneath her velvet and steel. For one suspended heartbeat, the cold sovereign vanished, and David saw the terrified, heartbroken girl looking back at him. The air crackled with the desperate, magnetic pull of a bond that refused to stay dead, a cosmic tether fighting against the brutal severing they had endured. But the vulnerability lasted only a fraction of a second. Lisa's jaw tightened, and she took a sharp step backward, breaking the physical connection. The glowing heat in David's wrist snapped out, leaving behind an aching, hollow cold. "Do not touch me," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking slightly before she forcefully leveled it out. "The bond is broken, Your Majesty. You saw to that yourself." David lowered his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, painful rhythm. "It is not entirely dead, Lisa. You felt it. I know you did. What I feel is irrelevant," she countered, adjusting her posture and burying the ghost of the girl beneath layers of impenetrable sovereignty. "Emotions do not feed armies. Nostalgia does not build walls. I have given you my terms. You have until dawn to convene your council, wrestle with your pride, and make your choice. When the sun rises, you will either kneel in the throne room and pledge Ethelgard to the east, or I will march my host back home and leave you to the mercy of the snows." She turned toward the heavy oak door, her movements crisp and decisive. She did not look back as she grasped the iron handle. "Dawn, David. Do not keep me waiting." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving David alone in the stifling silence, the phantom ache in his wrist pulsing like a second, dying heartbeat. The war room was buried deep within the bowels of the castle, a windowless, circular chamber of ancient granite, illuminated by the sputtering orange glow of a dozen iron braziers. The air was thick with the scent of burning pitch and the sour tang of anxiety. It was 3 hours past midnight, yet every major lord of the High Council had been summoned from their beds. They stood around the massive circular map table, their faces pale and drawn, muttering in hushed, panicked tones as they awaited their sovereign. When David pushed through the heavy iron-bound doors, the murmurs instantly died. He did not wear his crown. He wore simple, dark leather armor, a visual declaration that the time for courtly posturing had ended. The Alpha King walked to the head of the table, his presence sweeping through the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He placed his hands flat on the polished stone edge of the table, his amber eyes scanning the nervous faces of his counselors. "The Eastern Empire will supply us with 50,000 bushels of grain by the week's end," David began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded absolute silence. "They will provide refined steel for our armories, gold to rebuild the northern keeps, and a vanguard of 10,000 elite infantry to garrison the border." A collective sigh of relief washed over the lords. Shoulders dropped, and Lord Aris actually closed his eyes in a silent prayer of thanks. "Thank the ancestors," Lord Aris breathed. "The treaty is secured. What trade concessions did she demand, sire? Tariffs on the western lumber?" "She demanded no tariffs," David stated coldly, locking eyes with Lord Thorne, who stood directly across from him. "She demanded Ethelgard. Queen Alara has dictated that we become a vassal state. To secure this aid, I must publicly kneel and surrender absolute command of our military forces to her generals." The silence that followed was total, a vacuum of sound before the explosion. "Never!" Lord Thorne bellowed, slamming his fist onto the stone table, his face turning a mottled, furious purple. "It is an outrage, an insult to the blood of the founders. We are wolves, not lapdogs to be leashed by a cast-out stray. I say we bar the gates and slaughter her eastern escort in their beds. We take the queen hostage and force her empire to send the grain as ransom. You will do no such thing, Thorn, David snarled, his alpha aura flaring so violently that two of the lesser lords stumbled backward, clutching their chests. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and deepen around the king. Unless you wish to explain to this council how you plan to defeat the vanguard horde with a starving garrison. The name dropped into the room like a lead weight. Thorn blinked, his furious momentum suddenly derailing. The vanguard? Sire, they are miles away, a disorganized rabble. They are an army of 80,000, unified under a warlord, and they are marching south. David interrupted, his voice cutting through the damp air with absolute, clinical precision. He repeated the logistical nightmare Lisa had laid out for him, detailing the exhausted resources of the deep north and the inevitable collision course with Ethelgard's borders. He used her logic, her cold facts, dismantling the Lord's ignorance piece by piece. They will hit our northern border before the deep winter freeze. If we do not have eastern steel and eastern grain, Ethelgard will be a slaughterhouse. Even so, Thorn argued, though his voice had lost its thunder, taking on a desperate, venomous edge. We can find allies elsewhere. The Southern Isles mercenaries are bankrupting us, David roared, leaning over the table, his eyes flashing with raw, predatory fury. Do you take me for a fool, Thorn? I know about the secret envoys you sent to the Isles last month. You offered them the rights to our silver mines in exchange for a meager supply of rotting grain and a handful of sellswords. You were preparing to sell our kingdom piece by piece to save your own estates, while pretending to protect our sovereignty. Thorn paled, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The other lords shifted uncomfortably, suddenly distancing themselves from the exposed counselor. The twist of Thorn's secret betrayal hung in the air, a stark reminder of the rot within David's own court. We are standing on the edge of annihilation, David continued, his voice dropping back to a dangerous, vibrating calm. He straightened, drawing himself up to his full, imposing height. Pride will not feed our people. Sovereignty means nothing if we are all dead in the snow. Queen Ilara has offered us the only logical path to survival. The price is my pride, not yours. You would kneel to her, Your Majesty? Lord Aris asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and awe. The Alpha King, kneeling? I am the Alpha of this pack, David stated, his gaze sweeping over the room, meeting the eyes of every man present. And an Alpha's primary duty is to ensure the survival of his people. If I must break my own knees to shield this kingdom from the storm, then I will do so. We accept her terms. The nobility will revolt, Thorn whispered, his eyes darting toward the door, calculating his next move. Let them try, David promised, the promise of violence lingering heavily in his tone. Any lord who raises a banner against this decision will not face the Eastern Empire. They will face me, and I will not be merciful. David turned on his heel, his leather boots echoing loudly against the granite floor as he marched toward the heavy doors. Prepare the throne room for dawn. We are surrendering the kingdom. Dawn broke over Ethelgard, not with a triumphant display of morning color, but with a slow, agonizing bleed of slate-gray light creeping through the frosted windows of the great throne room. The air was frigid, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow and the sharp, sour tang of collective anxiety. The entire High Council stood assembled, flanked by the remnants of the royal guard. They were silent, their faces pale and drawn beneath the heavy furs of their station. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant, haunting howl of the wind, battering the high battlements. David stood before the ancient stone throne, wearing the ceremonial mantle of his ancestors for what he knew would be the very last time as an independent monarch. The heavy silver crown pressed into his brow, feeling less like a symbol of divine right and more like a beautifully forged shackle. He kept his posture impeccably straight, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of the room's crushing silence. His amber eyes remained fixed on the massive oak doors at the far end of the hall, waiting for the architect of his kingdom's salvation and its subjugation. Exactly as the first sliver of the pale sun breached the horizon, the heavy doors groaned inward. Lisa entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She was a vision of terrifying, calculated sovereignty. Gone was the midnight velvet from the evening before. Today, she wore the full, battle-ready regalia of the Eastern Empire. Her armor was a masterpiece of articulated dark steel and silver inlays, layered over a tunic of deep, blood-red silk. The delicate crown rested securely in her braided hair. Behind her marched 24 of her elite vanguard, their footsteps echoing in perfect, lethal synchronization, a rhythmic drumbeat of absolute dominance. She did not rush. She walked the length of the hall with the slow, measured grace of a predator that had already won the hunt. The lords of Ethelgard instinctively shrank back as she passed, their eyes averted, unable to meet the piercing, hazel gaze of the woman they had once mocked and discarded. David watched her approach, his heart beating a heavy, painful rhythm against his ribs. The alpha within him raged against the impending submission, scratching at the walls of his mind. But David ruthlessly forced the beast down. He was not doing this for himself. He was doing it for the thousands of families huddled in the freezing villages beyond the castle walls. Lisa halted precisely 5 paces from the base of the dais. Her guards spread out seamlessly, forming an impenetrable half-circle behind her. She looked up at David, her expression a flawless mask of porcelain and iron. There was no gloating in her eyes, no petty vindication. There was only the cold, hard reality of the transaction they were about to complete. "The sun has risen, King David," Lisa said, her melodic voice slicing through the heavy silence of the hall. "Have you made your choice?" "I have," David replied, his deep baritone rolling over the assembled crowd. He did not let his gaze waver from hers. He unfastened the heavy clasp of his royal mantle, allowing the thick, fur-lined velvet to slide from his shoulders and pool heavily on the stone floor. It was a deeply symbolic gesture, the shedding of his ultimate authority. He took a slow, deliberate breath, stepping down from the raised dais. With each step, the phantom scar on his wrist burned with a fierce, localized heat, as if the severed bond was screaming in protest, or perhaps in terrible recognition. He stopped 2 paces in front of her. Slowly, fighting the protests of his ancestral pride and the tightening of his muscles, David lowered himself. His right knee struck the polished marble floor with a dull, definitive thud. The sound echoed into the rafters, sealing the fate of a 600-year-old dynasty. A collective, strangled gasp arose from the Ethelgard lords, but David ignored them. He looked up at Lisa, offering his sovereignty to the girl who had once begged for his protection. "I, David of Ethelgard, surrender the absolute sovereignty of the North," he spoke, the ancient vows tasting like ash. "I pledge my armies, my lands, and my life to the Eastern Empire. I name you my suzerain, Queen Alara." Lisa looked down at him. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. David saw a flicker of profound, agonizing sorrow in her hazel eyes, a ghost of the bond they had shared. She reached out, her armored fingers hovering just inches from his bowed head, preparing to speak the words of acceptance. Then, the heavy silence was violently shattered by the sharp, distinct mechanical snap of a heavy crossbow string. David's alpha instincts flared with terrifying speed. The faint whistle of a steel bolt cutting through the air came from the upper gallery, angled perfectly downward. It was not aimed at him. It was aimed directly at the center of Lisa's chest. "Move!" David roared, launching himself upward. He did not think. He simply reacted. He tackled Lisa backward, his large frame twisting in midair to shield her. The heavy steel bolt struck the thick leather pauldron of his armor with a sickening crack, embedding itself deep into his shoulder. They crashed hard onto the marble floor, a tangle of limbs and steel. Chaos instantly erupted, the Eastern Guards drawing their blades as Ethelgard descended into absolute madness. The great hall devolved into a vortex of screaming lords, ringing steel and sheer, unrestrained panic. The Eastern vanguard moved with terrifying, lethal efficiency, instantly forming an impenetrable shield wall around where David and Lisa had fallen. Above them, in the shadowy alcoves of the upper gallery, a brief, violent scuffle broke out, before a cloaked figure was hurled over the balcony, crashing lifelessly onto the stone floor below. David grunted, his vision swimming for a brief, disorienting second as a wave of fiery, venomous pain radiated from his left shoulder. He was lying partially over Lisa, his heavy frame acting as a physical barricade. Beneath him, he felt the frantic, rapid flutter of her heartbeat through the layers of her steel armor. An intimate rhythm that instantly sent a jolt of protective adrenaline through his veins. "Are you harmed?" David rasped, his voice rough and breathless. He stared down into her face, mere inches from his own. Lisa's eyes were wide, the cold sovereign briefly eclipsed by genuine, breathless shock. The scent of her frost and iron spiked, mingling sharply with a heavy coppery smell of his own blood. "No," she breathed, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his uninjured arm. You took the bolt. It is my duty to protect my suzerain." David managed a tight, strained smile, though his amber eyes were rapidly dimming with pain. He rolled off her, fighting the sudden nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. Lisa was on her feet instantly, her military training overriding her momentary shock. "Captain!" she barked, her voice cutting cleanly through the cacophony of the hall. "Secure the perimeter. Lock down every gate and bar the doors. No one leaves this room alive until the traitor is identified." It was Thorne's faction. David ground out, using his right hand to push himself up into a kneeling position. The bolt was thick, its black fletching slick with a foul-smelling greenish residue. Poison. His alpha healing factor was already fighting it, the area around the wound burning with an intense, localized fever. But the pain was blinding. Lisa knelt beside him, her armored hands surprisingly gentle as she examined the angle of the bolt. "Do not move," she ordered, her tone shifting from absolute monarch to sharp, clinical commander. "The barb is deep. It must be cut out." She looked over her shoulder at her guards. "Bring my field surgeon, now." Within minutes, the chaotic hall had been subdued through sheer, overwhelming Eastern force. Lord Thorne and his closest allies were violently forced to their knees, disarmed and surrounded by drawn swords. The private Royal Solar, the same room where they had debated the kingdom's survival the night before, was hastily converted into a triage center. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off the wails of the arrested nobility. David sat shirtless on a wooden stool near the hearth, his skin pale and slick with a cold sweat. The Eastern surgeon, a quiet man with remarkably steady hands, had just finished extracting the bolt and packing the agonizing wound with a glowing, silver-laced poultice that neutralized the poison. Lisa stood by the fire, her back to him. She had removed her crown and her heavy steel gauntlets, her posture unnervingly rigid. The silence in the room was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that was far heavier than the political strife outside. "You did not have to do that." Lisa finally spoke, her voice lower, lacking the icy edge she usually wielded like a weapon. She turned to face him, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her face. "My guards would have intercepted it. I did not require you to throw yourself in front of a poisoned bolt, David. My body moved before my mind could register the angle." David replied, his voice slightly slurred from the painkillers the surgeon had administered. He looked at her, his amber eyes tired but piercing. "I told you yesterday, Lisa. My primary duty is the survival of my people. You are our only lifeline. I could not let you fall." "Was it purely tactical then?" she asked, stepping closer. Her eyes flicked briefly to the jagged, faded scar on his left wrist, which was currently flushed with an angry, red heat. "Or was it the ghost of a bond you claimed was dead?" Before David could formulate a lie that she would undoubtedly see through, the heavy door to the solar burst open. The Eastern captain stepped inside, followed closely by a scout clad in the white snow-dusted furs of the Northern Watch. The scout was shivering violently, his lips blue, his eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," the captain said, bowing sharply to Lisa. "But this man carries urgent intelligence from the northern perimeter. It could not wait." Lisa's posture instantly shifted back into the Iron Sovereign. "Report," she commanded. "The Horde, Queen Alara." The scout gasped, leaning against the wooden desk for support. "The scouts, we were wrong. They did not wait for the deep winter freeze to cross the Blackwater River. Their warlord, he possessed siege engines we had never seen. They smashed the ice dams upstream. The river has been frozen solid artificially." David pushed himself up from the stool, ignoring the screaming protest of his shoulder. "How far?" he demanded, his alpha command inadvertently bleeding into his tone. The scout swallowed hard, looking between the bleeding king and the terrifying queen. "They have bypassed the mountain choke point. They are not 3 weeks away, Your Majesty. They are less than 3 days' march from the outer walls of Ethelgard." The logistical reality dropped onto the room like an anvil. The assassination attempt had been a catastrophic waste of precious hours. The time for politics, for pride, and for resolving broken hearts was officially over. Lisa looked at the map on the desk, then slowly raised her eyes to meet David's. The cold calculation in her gaze had vanished, replaced by the grim, unyielding fire of a warrior cornered by a superior force. "Prepare your armor, David," Lisa ordered, the scent of frost in the room sharpening into a bitter, biting winter chill. "We march at noon." The march north was a grueling testament to their desperate alliance. Under the harsh light of a weak winter sun, the combined host of Ethelgard and the Eastern Empire moved as a single organism through the snow-choked valleys. David rode at the head of the vanguard, his heavy destrier carving a path through the drifts. Despite the glowing silver poultice packed tightly into his shoulder, a dull, throbbing ache radiated down his arm, a constant reminder of the poisoned bolt meant for the queen. He glanced right. Lisa rode beside him, a terrifying vision in dark steel and blood-red silk, her posture immaculate despite the biting wind whipping her braided hair. They had spoken little since leaving the castle. The frantic logistics of the march consumed every waking hour. But the silence between them lacked the suffocating weight of past betrayals. It was a tactical quiet, the focused calm of two apex predators approaching the same kill. The scouts report the vanguard horde halted at the ruins of Watcher's Pass. Lisa said, her voice cutting cleanly through the wind, completely free of its usual icy edge. They are attempting to funnel their siege engines through the narrow gorge. It is a logistical bottleneck. David nodded, scanning the jagged, frosted peaks looming on the horizon. It is the only path wide enough for their machines. But the gorge is a death trap if held by a disciplined shield wall. My ancestors bled southern invaders there centuries ago. Then we will bleed the horde today, Lisa replied, her hazel eyes locking onto his. There was no arrogance, only a grim, shared acknowledgement of the slaughter to come. The air grew unnaturally still as they crested the final ridge overlooking Watcher's Pass. Below them, a sea of dark, matted furs, rusted iron, and crude siege weaponry choked the valley floor. The vanguard horde was not merely an army. It was a force of nature, a teeming mass of wildlings driven by starvation and a singular, terrifying will. The deafening roar of their war horns echoed off the canyon walls, a primal sound that made the ancestral wolf within David bare its teeth in anticipation. "Infantry, form the phalanx," Lisa commanded, her voice amplified by the sheer force of her sovereign aura. The eastern vanguard moved with breathtaking precision, interlocking their heavy tower shields to form an impenetrable wall of steel across the mouth of the gorge. "Aethelgard!" David roared, drawing his broadsword. The sheer volume of his alpha command sent a physical shockwave through the ranks. "To the flanks! Let them crash against the eastern iron, and we tear their throats out from the sides." The clash was catastrophic. The vanguard horde slammed into the eastern shield wall like a tidal wave of flesh against a breakwater. The sound of splintering wood and dying men drowned out the howling wind. David threw himself into the fray, his broadsword a blur of lethal, calculated violence. He fought with the desperate fury of a king protecting his home. But his eyes constantly tracked the flash of midnight velvet and dark steel in the center of the line. Lisa wielded a slender, deadly longsword with a grace that belied the brutal efficiency of her strikes. But the horde was endless. A massive warlord clad in the thick hides of a dire bear smashed through the eastern lines, his heavy warhammer shattering shields like glass. He charged directly toward Lisa, recognizing the gleaming silver crown upon her head. "Lisa!" David bellowed, carving a path through the writhing mass of bodies, ignoring the screaming protest of his shoulder. He reached her just as the warlord brought the massive hammer down. David intercepted the blow, his boots sliding backward in the blood-slicked snow under the crushing impact. He grunted, his knees buckling, the poison suddenly flaring with blinding agony. Lisa did not hesitate. As David absorbed the warlord's monstrous momentum, she pivoted fluidly, stepping into the narrow opening. She drove her longsword upward, finding the infinitesimal gap in the brute's thick, overlapping armor. The warlord collapsed with a gurgling roar, but half a dozen heavy infantry immediately took his place, their jagged weapons raised high to avenge their fallen leader. David and Lisa were completely surrounded, their backs pressed tightly against one another, their breathing perfectly synchronized. In that desperate, breathless moment, David felt it. The jagged scar on his left wrist ignited. A brilliant, blinding silver light erupted from his skin, matching an identical glow shining through the steel plating over Lisa's heart. The severed bond, starved by rejection, suddenly surged back to life, feeding on the absolute synchronization of their shared survival. It wasn't a chain of subjugation. It was a conduit of pure, resonant power. As their combined aura exploded outward, leveling the encroaching enemy in a shockwave of force, David realized the truth. He hadn't just saved his kingdom. He had finally found his equal. The Battle of Watcher's Pass became legend, remembered for the day two monarchs forged an unbreakable empire in the blood-stained snow. Ethelgard did not fall to a conquering tyrant. It rose alongside a queen who turned her deepest betrayal into her greatest strength, and a king who finally learned that true sovereignty required yielding to love. The severed bond, once a symbol of shame, became the radiant foundation of a new, unified era. Did you enjoy David and Lisa's epic journey from heartbreak to an unstoppable alliance? If this tale of betrayal, redemption, and undeniable fate kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to like this story, share it with fellow readers, and subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic adventures.